gentlemen, I'll make a start on the evidence meeting tonight, evidence meeting 6. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here as always. I know it's a bit cold outside and there's a bit of a queue, so we might get people wandering in as the evidence session progresses. But for those that are here, I'd just like to welcome you. I'll just introduce Martin Doherty Hughes, who's the Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, so it's a pleasure to have him here at this session as well. As always in these, time is of the essence because we always have a lot of speakers and a lot of debaters engaged. So I'll ask the speakers to make their own presentations for about 5 minutes if you would please, and then we will open it up to the floor. We do film these, so the camera will be rolling, and just in case that anyone does want to ask a question, we'll get into the question and answer session. If you would actually stand up and give your name and your organisation, it just makes it easier for those that will then watch this later on. Just a little bit of housekeeping in terms of the vote. We are expecting the vote potentially when this finishes. It might come before, but if Martin and I do vacate the chairs, it will simply because we've got to go and fulfil our duty, what we're paid to do, and not because we're running away from any awkward question or anything that might be thrown our way. We have got quite a number of speakers, so I will get on with this and let them speak. We'll start with Peter, I think, and if we work our way up, and then we get to the end, and we'll go into the question and answer session. So, Peter, first of all.
Sure. Thank you very much, Damien. So I'm Peter Hunt, a lawyer and founder of two organisations, the Accord Project and also Clause. Clause is a legal tech startup that builds tooling for enterprises to form, execute and manage smart legal contracts. And the Accord Project is an open source non-profit initiative comprising some 60 of the world's leading law firms, including the entirety of the Magic Circle here in London, standards bodies like IEEE, NGOs, DLT technology providers, the likes of IBM, R3, Digital Asset, Tezos, and a bunch of others. So it's a uniquely techno-legal organisation. It has two core goals. Firstly, to develop an industry-led implementation-agnostic specification for smart legal contracts. Such a specification seeks to establish a universal common foundation for the anatomy of a smart legal contract. How do we bind natural language and logic together? How do we build modular components comprised of executable clauses? How do we generate obligations that can be omitted from these contracts? How can we verify the state of contracts? And secondly, to embody that specification in open source code, so anyone can pick up those code libraries and instantiate that within applications that they're building. So given the focus of the project, I'm going to comment on the use of smart contracts for legal application. In other words, how do we render contracts that we use today in commercial transactions executable or at least partially executable? So smart legal contracts hold huge promise in our opinion. Ultimately, that promise is the creation of a contracting stack, a series of technical tools that enable us to fundamentally improve the functioning of legal transactions. We can imagine a future where contracts move from static concepts to dynamic concepts capable of a degree of real-time state, where contracts can manage property rights per their terms. Examples being the sale of a license to creative contracts, to managing registered property, such as the process of buying and selling real property, to complex derivatives transactions. And then we can move on from when we've got that to dispute resolution around smart contracts using that real-time data. So at a high level, this means reducing transaction costs in managing contracts, improving the accuracy and efficiency of transactions, hopefully increasing the certainty and reducing disputes. The implications are that we can, by orders of magnitude, improve the operation and provision of legal services. And that's feasible today. Indeed, to put it into context, it's been a few years since we at the Accord Project conducted the first IoT-enabled smart legal contract. But this is a nascent technology and we need to be cognizant of that. We need to finally balance the need to facilitate conditions to allow stakeholders to use and experiment with the technology safely and with an appropriate degree of certainty, at the same time as recognizing that we are early on in this journey. Our belief is that smart legal contracts will start out to be at least partially executable through a concept that we call smart clauses. The idea that you can instantiate a smart clause that automates a portion of that contract within an otherwise natural language document, but not necessarily self-executing contracts. Some use cases are suitable for that, others not so. For example, automating an escrow payment upon specified conditions, you may want to have a human to initiate that transaction rather than a contract automating that themselves. Standards are very important in this area. So building in layers from foundations upwards enables us to create a reference framework for using smart legal contracts. We mustn't rush into regulation. We've seen this in this regulation first approach in the US, which creates disharmony between different states, particularly in their views of what a blockchain is, what a smart legal contract actually is. So our view is the appropriate approach for government to take in developing the technology is to develop a three-pillar framework. Firstly, establishing techno-legal foundations for smart legal contracts, addressing the aforementioned issues. This produces an environment with a baseline for concerted experimentation, importantly in a DLT-agnostic manner. As a fast-moving technology, we cannot afford to be bound too tightly to a given DLT implementation. The Accord project is working on this with leading stakeholders and DLT providers. The second point is we need technical tooling to enable users to begin to use this technology in the wild, so to speak. The foundational technology is available and additional tooling is being built at present. This includes open source code libraries for templating and execution, programming languages specifically engineered for expressing legal concepts. And future steps include interfacing those templating and programming languages with online dispute resolution bodies. The third pillar is a work on establishing an appropriate legal environment, which requires an assessment of the existing common law and statutory frameworks, the abilities of English law to deal with edge cases, and ultimately whether additional regulation is needed. The work of the Law Tech Delivery Panel and the Law Commission here is absolutely the correct approach in our opinion. I'm sure Christina and Siobhan will come on to those in a bit. So our view is that governments seek to facilitate the creation of this environment in a way that enables the sea change that smart legal contracts will enable us to bring to fruition, to improve the operation of commercial transactions whilst appreciating that the technology will develop rapidly, thus requiring an appropriate degree of flexibility. To this end, my recommendation is that the government should support the development of a framework similar to that I've outlined. Doing so enables the UK to move forward in a concerted effort to build appropriate techno-legal foundations into our legal system that is the envy of the world. The risk of not moving forward in such a manner is that other states might challenge the dominance of the UK jurisdiction in this area. But this is not only needed to maintain our position in the world stage, but affords us an opportunity to become the world's most efficient jurisdiction for commercial transactions.
Thank you, Peter, for that. I just like the aim of bringing language and logic together, something that many members of this place would benefit from. Thank you. We'll move up, Charles.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Kerrigan. I'm a practicing lawyer. I work on funding technology projects and businesses, including using smart contracts. So first, I think we need to be clear what we're talking about. We start with contracts before we get to smart contracts. Contracts are flexible tools, simply agreements intended to be enforceable at law. But we need to be clear, and I'll give 3 examples of what that means in this context. First, the context matters. There's a big difference between buying an ice cream, buying a house, buying a group of companies. They would all use contracts, but the context is crucial. The second is that lawyers will make assumptions about contracts depending on our training and upbringing. So under English law, we recognise a principle of freedom of contract, that contracts can by and large contain whatever terms the parties intend. Under other systems, for example, French law, there is a distinction between civil contracts and commercial contracts, reflecting a regulatory and policy desire to protect consumers. The third part of that clarity is don't assume that lawyers have all the answers, because we have preconceptions. Lawyers naturally want to categorise and systematise the things that they deal with. It's very early for smart contracts, and I think we need to see what they can do before we decide how we should categorise them. Lawyers are trained that contracts have certain named features. So lots of the literature around smart contracts at the moment talks about offer and acceptance, consideration, and similar. And commentators note that smart contracts don't always meet those criteria. It's not clear that it matters. The current question is what the contracts can do rather than what they should do. And also that contracts have those features that lawyers are trained to recognise, because from a policy perspective they address features that courts have found to be significant in the past. But there's a major implicit assumption in there that courts are required for the enforcement of contracts. Brings me to my second point, the benefits of smart contracts. So first, they push back the boundaries. For example, the assumption that I've just described. The original Bitcoin white paper stressed the irreversible nature of transactions on a blockchain. It's a key benefit of blockchain technology that court enforcement is not a part of it. Why is it useful? A personal comment here, I think it relates to the benefits of commoditisation. My career around what's now called fintech has seen an ongoing commoditisation in banking and payments. And in payments, the goal is always reducing what we call friction, bringing speed, accuracy, and consistency. These are clear features of smart contracts. In the digital economy, where I spend a lot of my time working, smart contracts address some of the key concerns that float around that economy: verification, authentication, security, control, and audit. And English law has a potential benefit here because the freedom of contract principle exists. We're well suited to, so the freedom of contract principle exists, we're well suited to being able to deal with these types of issues. So I turn next as a third point to the problems with smart contracts. We've been invited to say what they might be. I divide them into two buckets. The first, I think, are perceived problems. Again, a lot of the literature describes a number of conventional points that I think may not be as significant as they're currently stressed. Some examples of these are smart contracts enforceable? The short answer is yes, by their nature they're enforceable, back to the blockchain and Bitcoin white paper. Where do you sue if there's no agreement on jurisdiction? Again, the short answer is that you don't need to sue if they are self-executing. That's a feature and a function. How are liability issues dealt with? That can be part of the program. There can be insurance solutions, and the market is working on those, both the digital economy market and the insurance market. We hear often that they don't deal with complex contracts. That is true, but to take my other example, more people buy ice creams than buy groups of companies. I think there are some real problems with smart contracts. The Internet of Things will throw up some of that. We have too much information. We'll be too reliant on systems operating well together, which is a transparency issue, not because we have a black box problem, but because we have a box which is so full of stuff that we can't untangle it. So we go from a black box problem to a Christmas lights problem. We've got genuine hard problems around equity, good faith, fairness, reasonableness, things that lawyers write into contracts sometimes to hide ambiguity or points that aren't specifically addressed at the time the contracts are signed. And we have the obvious questions around regulation. Who is responsible? Where is the off switch? Will regulators take action against the software developers, some users, all users, something else? And finally, we've got some terminology questions that I think are difficult, distinguishing between contracts, smart contracts, automation more broadly, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, we need to be unpacking that. So what should government do? I brought a number of questions without answers, I'm afraid, but hopefully that's relevant at this early stage of the group. First, we have policy questions arising from the fact that we're looking to see what regulation would be suitable where the regulator has less information than the firms and parties involved in this environment. Second, that one of the consequences of automation will be a shift from negotiated contracts, which is the history of contracts, to a world, I assume, of regulated contracts, where public policy parameters will be placed around the ability and perhaps some restrictions on the freedom of contract that we've seen under English law. I think we'll all say something about standards. There's clearly a need for a standard. The more automation that we have, the more that will need to be output and outcome based rather than input based. I can see a role for insurance, at least where problems relate to financial risk and loss. And we still have an open question under English law around the recognition of digital assets. We know under English law that information is not property. I think that concept will be tested more and more as time goes on. So some questions for government. I finish with a closing thought, which is an old chestnut here. We're talking about technology. It's important not to lose sight of the fact that technology is technique, not ideology.
Some very good questions there. I'm sure we can get back to you with an answer sometime. I would like to say when at this moment in time. You mentioned friction there. Of course, we all know about that these days, but usually talk about trade. It's interesting that it's there with smart contracts as well. We will just slightly go out of sync here because I've been reliably told for the first time from a duo of speakers where Siobhan will follow Charles. So I'll bring in Siobhan at this point.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. Over the next few minutes I'll explain what the Law Commission is, the work that we're doing on smart contracts, and our next steps. And thank you, Charles, for letting me share your slide. So, what is the Law Commission? We're a statutory body which is independent of government. We're established under the Law Commissions Act 1965 to keep the law of England and Wales under review and to recommend reform where necessary. We give advice to government and we make recommendations for law reform with the aim that the law should be fair, simple, cost-effective and modern. And the Law Commission's been asked by government to look at smart contracts. The purpose of the project is to ensure that the law is sufficiently certain and flexible to apply in a global digital context and to highlight any areas which lack clarity or which lack certainty. And as some of you will know, the Law Commission's a consultative body, and we've recently started the project and we've been speaking to lawyers, computer scientists, academics and tech firms to identify questions of legal uncertainty which we could usefully consider. Some of the issues which I mention now will be familiar because Charles has helpfully introduced them. But so far the issues which stakeholders have raised have included questions of contract law, including interpretation, applicable law and remedies, and also the issues of equity, good faith and reasonableness. Questions of liability, so what happens when a smart contract does not execute as expected, and how will liability be allocated between, how it be allocated at all for the resulting loss. And finally, questions of digital assets and intangible property, such as whether tokens are intangible property, and whether legislation such as the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 should be reviewed. Some thrilling stuff. So we're keen to hear from as many stakeholders as possible who have an interest in smart contracts. And so in early 2019, we're going to be publishing a call for evidence with a consultation period, and that will be followed by a symposium hosted at the Law Society. And we expect that the results of the call for evidence and our symposium will focus our work going forward. In our call for evidence, we will be asking stakeholders questions along 3 key themes. The first is, what are smart contracts actually being developed for and used for? For example, we've been told that they're primarily being considered for insurance, derivatives and trade finance, but are there other use cases we should be considering? Secondly, what are the blockers to implementation and use of smart contracts? Are there legal blockers? And thirdly, what should we do about the legal blockers? As I've said, the Law Commission would generally make recommendations for law reform to government, but in this particular project, we want to be facilitative. So it may be that a simple explanation of the law, or exposition of the law, or a code of practice, or even examples of best practice are what's needed. Or perhaps some issues do require legislative reform. Really, overall, the message I want to get across tonight is that we're in listening mode and we're keen to hear what stakeholders have to say.
Thank you for that. I presume when you said modern, you weren't referring to the 1882 legislation that
Yes.
you want to change. We'll move back into sync now, so Vinny's come in if you would like to.
Great. Apologies for being late. So the perspective that I want to take here is from the somewhat brutalist, just get stuff done energy industry. The position that we're in is that my company is implementing a set of commercial infrastructure for being able to move around things like houses and cars and container loads of wellies, using smart contracts in a very commonplace commercial setting. Nothing complex, nothing esoteric. And it turns out that if you take the right approach, there is very little need for legislative change to get that stuff to work. Because it turns out that we've actually been using computers to keep track of property for a rather long time. And smart contracts are basically just an extension of using computers to keep track of property. So we don't see an urgent need for legislative change to make sure that contracts are contracts. Because the existing frameworks are pretty flexible, right? Anything from an agreement over dinner without notes taken, without confirmation, through to formal kind of magic circle law firm documentation. It's all contract. The place where things become slippery is getting hold of things and identifying them in a way which is modern. So the shortcoming is not so much contracts as contracts. The shortcoming is things like who signed the contract. There's some need for identity layers that allow us to accurately identify when a person has assented to a contract and whether that person is acting in their role as an individual or in their role as a corporate officer. There's a very clear need to be able to figure out in a very reliable, direct liability managing way in what role somebody is acting and who is acting. Similarly, when we come to identification of assets, a lot of things that we want to identify in the economy don't actually have any sensible machine identifiable handle. A laptop may have a serial number, but then we have to identify which company the laptop belongs to, and it's not immediately obvious if we have a serial number which manufacturer it refers to. So we have a general underlying problem with the identification of stuff. And then in the areas where government manages ledgers and registers which identify stuff in a kind of final and authoritative way, it's quite hard to get access to those ledgers in a way which is convenient for kind of machine contract. The obvious example is things like land registries. There just aren't the handles to be able to do something like conveyance a house without going through a very long, very manual, multi-step process with tons of intermediaries. So there's a limit to how far you can go in digitization of trade if we can't get the assets to show up inside of the systems that we want to digitize. It's all very well to have a contract, but if the machine-readable contract turns out not to be able to bind to machine-readable identity and machine-readable asset identification, you kind of are back to square one as soon as you want to do something that hits the real world. And we think of this as being something that contributes to the crisis of value in the blockchain space. Right now, I think Ethereum is back down to the levels that it was at 18 months ago. It's probably, an 85% drop over the course of the last 3 months. And that's largely happening because it's very hard to put these technologies to work for anything other than the creation of financial instruments or collectible cybercrap. because we just don't have the access routes into the real world. So if there's anything that we would like to see as an industry, it's easier access to the fundamental namespaces the government maintains. People, companies, houses, cars, potentially copyright and patent. These are things where government is the final authority on what exists and what doesn't exist. And it would be very convenient for us if we could get, for example, digitally signed certificates from government stating who owns a given asset. The database is already a government asset. You take it out, you stick the Crown digital signature on it, you hand it out to businesses, they can then use that as a fact that the government will stand behind and vouch for. Yes, we definitely told you that on the following date. If it turns out not to be true, we're very sorry about that. So there's a lot of room for building the supporting commercial infrastructure around the smart contract economy in ways which would be enormously facilitating for trade and development without necessarily requiring a lot of fundamental rewiring about our thinking of contracts. And I want to be conservative here and say that as long as we stick to fundamental principles, we should be able to keep track of technology. In 5 years, this discussion may be largely about artificial intelligence of contract, and at that point, we ought to be sticking to our guns on the fundamental understanding of law rather than constantly trying to chase technology. It's quite attractive to be modern and to follow the technology, but the technology is moving so quickly that there will always be a gap. If you stick to the fundamentals, the technology should be largely irrelevant to the process of law. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about a little is the trade facilitation construct. So right now we're in a position where the primary use that I think most people see in my corner of the industry for blockchains is trade facilitation. International trade is horrendously inefficient. Business-to-business trade is largely pre-digitization. I think everybody in this room has probably at some point tried to chase a defective invoice. And what you discover is that the world is just a nightmarish sea of disorganized paperwork and erroneous spreadsheets. That stuff is probably eating 5, 10, 50% of global GDP. And it's the direct kind of paperwork equivalent of the stevedores that used to carry goods on or off ships one bag at a time. We went to containerization, we went to robotic ports, we went to robotic cranes, and the allegation is that this is something like 7% of global GDP is traced back to sea containers. So the notion that automation of contract has the same kind of transformative economic potential, I think is very plausible because we all know that handling paperwork sucks. Everything about these processes is broken at every scale of the economy. So the way that we see this playing out in the next, let's say 20 years, is the total transformation of the paperwork handling of trade into systems where you've got smooth interoperation and things like invoices have numbers which are the same for everybody who touches the invoice. What this leads to is the possibility for a new era of international trade based not on platform agreements like the European Union treaties or NAFTA, where everything has to be equalized between all the partners, but through something that looks much more like Internet Protocol standardization, where everybody publishes their requirements for food labeling in, say, machine-readable form, everybody publishes their customs policy in machine-readable forms, and the computers just figure out what you can do where and automate as much of the compliances as possible. And if we're going to get to this kind of future where we have strong national sovereignty because we simply define our laws and then publish in machine-readable formats what we require, and then the machinery takes care of the problems by mass customizing goods for the markets they're going into, handling the labeling, pushing the paperwork. I think we could get to a position where we have both strong sovereignty but also highly liquid trade. And this we think of as being kind of the post-industrial wave of globalization. We see the blockchain and the smart contract as being small building blocks in that future, but if there is a long-term trajectory here, I think it has to be looking at automation of all the bureaucratic processes of trade, from contracts that exist between businesses right the way through to compliance with regulation at the nation-state level and above. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, and seamlessly done. So that worked well. Christina, I'd like to bring you in now.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity. My name is Christina Blackwells, and I'm the President of the Law Society of England and Wales. And I'm going to share with you a few thoughts about the impact of smart contracts on the legal profession. First of all, a little bit of context. Distributed ledgers enable the coding at present of simple contracts that execute under specified conditions. So either something like a bond expiry, probate, something like that. And law firms and other businesses are highly interested in the use cases here. So, for example, Hogan Lovells have been studying how this technology could eliminate many of the manual steps typically needed to execute contracts. We've got AXA with their product called Fizzy, which is a smart insurance contract that executes automatically based on airline delay information, and which is held in the Ethereum blockchain. Smart contracts can aid in the protection of things like intellectual property. Time-stamping data allows anyone to store a hash of any document in the blockchain, thus proving that it existed at a particular point in time. And that is an incredibly valuable thing. So smart contracts can protect copyright, automate the sale of creative works online, eliminate the risk of file copying and redistribution, a very important element. And I wanted to give you another context, which is how the Law Society is involved. I chair the Law Tech Delivery Panel, which has already been referenced, and I'm pleased to say that two other panellists here are members of some of our task forces. The purpose of the Law Tech Delivery Panel really is twofold. First of all, it is to ensure that we have a supportive and energetic environment in the UK for inward investment and development to scale of law tech businesses. And secondly, and equally importantly, that we have the right legislative and regulatory frameworks, and that may be standards as opposed to legislation. We'll discover that on our journey, which we are obviously undertaking very closely with the Law Commission. My main point, I think, this evening is to make the case that smart contracts can be the lawyer's friend, and that our law, our jurisdiction, is particularly well attuned to being able to solve some of the unique commercial problems that may be presented by these advanced technologies. And it's not just me who thinks this. There are many in government, many in the judiciary, and I want to point particularly to one of my panel members, that is the Chancellor of the High Court, Sir Geoffrey Voss. And Geoffrey has identified a number of interesting consequences from the use of smart contracts, which we feel need to be looked at. So, first of all, that ultimately the law of smart contracts is likely to be chosen by the parties, even if computer coding experts may insist that there is no legal foundation needed, because the essence of a smart contract is in the code. We believe that actually there will be need for legal context within that. So it is premature at this point to predict the death of litigation, despite hurrah! Despite, no, I joke, but it is. So despite some saying that smart contracts by their nature can't lead to litigation, inevitably some would, even if it's only because somebody is saying that they were misled or deceived outside the terms of the underlying computer code. So there will still be commercial disputes to resolve, but they will need to be resolved for the benefit of law tech software, which will much reduce the workload of litigation lawyers. Disclosure, so far as it would be necessary, would likely be automated, and this will require a much greater understanding by lawyers of computer code to be able to interpret the smart contracts. Disclosure is likely to be shorter because all documents will be either in the cloud or sorted and analysed by AI. And smart contracts and automated documentation would, in effect, significantly reduce the grunt work of the transactional lawyers. But I would suggest that we would inevitably have to have more regulation to make online a safe space. And this would mean there would be more work for those involved with ensuring that businesses and individuals are compliant with regulation in almost every sector. So transactional lawyers will continue to be in demand to provide legal advice as to the effect of the automated transactions to which their clients are signing up. However smart a contract might be, I'd suggest that its legal consequences and its effects may need to be explained to human beings whose money is being engaged by other human beings. There have been issues which I won't go into because I know time is short, but around the legal enforceability of smart contracts. And we've discussed that already in a sense. But I wanted to raise the issue of semantics. So even if a contract is self-executing in the sense that the pre-specified action happens automatically, it doesn't necessarily mean that the relevant action will be legally final in all circumstances. And this is further complicated by the inherent semantic ambiguity of legal terms. So if we think about terms such as in good faith or commercially reasonable, how are we reducing these to the smart contract? So in conclusion, I don't think all is lost for the legal profession. I think that there will be more but different work for lawyers, that we will be undertaking tasks that are significantly different to those that we undertake at the moment, but we will be required to continue to advise and to support our clients. And beyond that, there are some key issues here for society as to how we are going to be able to contract with each other, between individuals and businesses, between individuals, businesses and the state. And that is a very, very important and challenging issue, and one which we on the Law Tech Delivery Panel and the Law Commission hand in hand will be trying to address. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for that. It's encouraging to know that our law is advancing potentially this technology, and also interesting that you're very concerned with the workload of litigation lawyers. I'm sure they'll be pleased to hear you speaking up for them. We'll move now to Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Gibney. I'm the CTO and founder of Seal Software, and we are a legal AI company that deals with creation of models and processes to extract information from existing contracts that are there today, but also from digital contracts, and also working with the blockchain to facilitate the sharing of information. So you'll notice that I'm technical, so it's different to the other people on the panel here, which means my talk, well, yeah, my talk is going to be well under 5 minutes, let's put it this way. So, and I'm going to focus more on some negative sides, because we all have to think that smart contracts, even though they are tokened as being smart, they're not. And I work with bugs every day. And working with bugs every day, when you're trying to code things like this into a contract that is supposed to auto-complete without parties being part of it, on a medium that you can't go ahead and change very easily, raises some significant challenges for us going forward. There's also some technical challenges that we need to think about, but I'll get to that in a moment. So smart contracts, let's look at it from a longevity standpoint. Let's say I'm creating a contract for an airline, or a plane, or a will. I create a will at the age of 28. I die when I'm 90. In that time, technology has moved on significantly. Just because I have a hash on the blockchain that says that this is the document, it is not potentially going to be the same document that is there when you die. I'll come to why shortly, but it's not. So we have to consider things that span many generations, and just looking at where we are today, we're not doing that. We're not really considering what may come in the future, and we need to take a little bit of a rest break to consider some of these things. Also, any kind of contract, whether it be a paper contract, a digital contract, or a smart contract, or as we work with machine learning and AI, a actual intelligent contract has to have a linkage to the outside world. Otherwise, it's useless. There's a massive issue with that, because when you link things to an outside world that rely on events, who is it responsible for telling you those events actually happened? There's things called oracles. Oracles can be hacked. Even if oracles go into an enclave, which is a method to secure the code itself, you can still have a method to hack the referential information that maybe a smart contract is looking at. That can cause a knock-on effect. Christina mentioned who is responsible if these things happen. Well, now both parties are going to be in a position where they're arguing because somebody else hacked it. So who is it that is responsible for those payments that may be lost? If we look at where we are today with the amount of money that's been lost, that's the only thing we can say about smart contracts. They have lost a massive amount of money. So what we should look at in this instance is actually having a method to have a distributed set of oracles. And that distributed set of oracles is then used in a consensus way. Why not? We already do this when it comes to the blockchain. We have a consensus mechanism. We should have that with oracles as well, in a method to be able to have a model of such that can work with that. So if we're looking at how we create the smart contracts at the moment, they are very dumb, I would say. They're very simple code, but we even get that wrong. So we need to start looking at how we can integrate actually machine learning and AI within this process from the very beginning. Because if we start to do that, we can start to understand and predict and see where things can go wrong, and we can start to work from the beginning with where we're going to, which is actually making them much more intelligent. We don't want to be looking at smart contracts, we want to be looking at more intelligent contracts. So if we then take the final step of the things I'm talking about, I mentioned before about the length of time contracts can last. Well, now we have to consider the data itself. Who owns the data for that length of time? Who's allowed to learn from that data? How is that data potentially destroyed? Because if you're going to create a set of smart contracts, there's information within those that can be used to learn from, predict from. And if we look in the actual world we live in now, with the Googles, the Facebooks, nearly all of the money they generate is based on the data they own. And that is just going to get more and more as we go forward. So, there's 4 things that I would like to see that we look at and to try and address. And that is that we need that trustable set of oracles, and the best way to do that, potentially governments can get together and form a set of trustable oracles that everyone can refer to. It has been mentioned. Much like we have the DNS system today, which is the name resolution that everybody uses without even knowing about it for the internet, that's controlled centrally, and that's used for many more things now than it ever was before. Also, we need to look at data ownership and how that works, and destruction. We need to understand how we can destroy information when people die, potentially. If you're writing it to an immutable medium, then you need to find a way of putting a method to remove that data that flows through as well. We also need to look at making sure that AI and ML is integrated from the start. We're not. At the moment, we're just looking at basic code. That is not going to be good enough to get us to where we go to. Ambiguity, as one of my colleagues wrote in a blog, is going to be the killer, because, as has been mentioned, there's certain things you can't codify, like best efforts. A best efforts clause is pretty impossible to actually get right in any kind of code. And then we need, as we are doing today, there needs to be a bridge between where we are now with paper and getting to the digital age. Vinay mentioned that as well, that we can't go forward until we have that process. So we need to look at how we can better incorporate all of this into that system. So that is where I stand. I want to move from smart to intelligent. I want to look at making sure that we take all of the things that may be of an issue going forwards. And one of the things that we have to look at, because technology is changing so quickly, is quantum computing. Because all of this that we're talking about now will be completely redundant when quantum computing gets to the point where it's at room temperature, enough qubits, all of this will be done. Because you won't have any kind of cryptography that you can use that will be of a secure nature. So, I've sort of pretty much laid out. I'm negative in some ways to this, but there is also a lot of benefits if we get it right. So it's about getting it right and trying to get it right from the start.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think you've got to recognise the challenges before you can maximise the potential, so well worth pointing that out. And we'll come to Shirley now as our final guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. I'm Shirley Bailey-Wood, Director of Information Solutions, so responsible for the standards team at BSI. By way of context, I know some of you who are experts in the room already know this, but BSI is appointed by HMG as the UK standards body, and we provide the infrastructure for UK experts to get involved in international, European and or local national standards development, and we manage the process around that, and we manage that array of information for the UK and include the public policy interests within that. We ensure that standards are developed in accordance with international rules, so we're meeting the objectives of the World Trade Organisation's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, so the principles of open public consultation, transparency, stakeholder engagement in particular, and consensus around that are the principles by which we have to operate and operate very effectively. Today I'm really supplementing the other speakers because I'm discussing the context or the concept of smart contracts around the efforts in standardisation. So I'm just going to summarise what's in progress for DLT as standardisation, obviously focusing on smart contracts primarily, but within the context of how the market will accept technologies and systems based in DLT. We are engaged in smart contract standardisation at the international level. There's quite a lot of activity already underway. The standards series that's in development on blockchain is really aiming to assist acceptance of the technology within business. It's still emerging technology. So we find ourselves in a very common place with emerging technology and standardisation. In our parlance, you get used to numbers if you're in the world of standards. The international community working in this area is known as the ISO Technical Committee 307. There are 39 countries actively participating, and the UK is very active in this, which is great to see representation from a very wide sector of industries, government, academia, legal, financial services, technology providers, professional bodies. It's great. We've got a very substantial committee. Among the international standards in development, there is a standard entitled Smart Contracts that may be legally binding technical specification. So it is set to address how such smart contracts are written, how they're enforced, and how to ensure that the automated performance of a smart contract is faithful to the meaning of any relevant contractual documentation. And it's important in that context to recognise that some smart contracts may not necessarily be contracts in terms of having a legally binding intention, but may well become so, giving rise to enforceable obligations. The standards work is still a few years away from landing. Alongside this international committee work, we're fast-tracking other work here, thankfully in the UK, which can happen at a much faster rate. Two areas being worked on are initial coin offerings and smart contracts again. The work on small contracts is in partnership with the Accord project, and the outcome of that is intended to be a code of practice for the technical implementation and use of smart legal contracts, so it should complement the international work. The UK leadership in financial services and legal services is very well known and sought after by other countries. There are various factors that could affect UK leadership. Touching on one that's relevant to this APPG is technology, R&D. The financial sector is very well known for its investment in blockchain, and the banks were one of the first to embrace and invest, worried about the threat of Bitcoin, but also seeing the opportunity to streamline the sector and to improve processes, remove intermediaries. The legal sector has not been as active, but there are exceptions to that. I say this in the context of UK governments supporting innovation in this area through programmes such as the UK Industrial Strategy, Challenge Funds. This programme has 8 challenges, but there is one that recognises the importance of R&D investment. This Next Generation Services Challenge Fund is promoting investment to develop R&D strength of the legal, accounting and insurance sectors. So I think it's very relevant to be aware of that and to get involved. Blockchain does have some negative perceptions around it, newness of the technology, lack of regulation, negative stories to some degree around Bitcoin. We are aware that to gain mass market usage, again, common with any new technology, smart contracts need to be taken up not just by the technical community, but be accepted by consumers and by business. And so I mention that in the context of the broader suite of international standards that are underway. They're looking at some key areas such as privacy, security of data, good governance frameworks, to name but a few. These all helped, protect identities, give transparency around that, reduce security risks, vulnerabilities, and in particular, some of the frameworks around interoperability and compatibility will help avoid technology lock-in, and again will help build consumer confidence. And worth again noting for the UK and the UK's strength here, they are leading, and we are leading the work on international work on interoperability, security and identity. So again, great to see. To conclude our evidence, we are devising and putting in place what we believe will be the underpinnings and framework of standards that will create a pathway for our UK expertise and influence. When it comes to standards, the most practical step for us and for our experts is to see HMG involved. They very much appreciate that input, that opinion early on, rather than after the fact when opinions are being more strongly formed. So bringing perspectives and experience in early into these communities is really, really well received and important. Following that, we'd also welcome HMG's support to encourage implementation of the standards, alongside any regulation, of course, that may emerge, but helping standards to let the technology achieve its full potential. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, and it's encouraging to see that Britain playing a very active role on the international stage in that area. I will open up to the floor now with questions. Just if you are asking a question and you're not round the tables, it's most people at the back, if you could stand up and say who you are and what company you represent, and then give your question, so we can pick that up on the film, and also to the panel know who they're addressing their answer to as well. But before I do formally open the floor, I'll ask my deputy if he would like to ask the question first.
Thank you, Chair. Kevin. Oracles. You know, when I look back in mythology, I often think oracles standing over vapours and inhaling and, you know, to use the language, but stoned for a long period of time. So I was a bit kind of taken aback when you mentioned the terminology. But given the fact that, first of all, as a Scottish constituency MP, that there are separate legal jurisdictions within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, would you not agree that there are already 3 legal systems or 3 centres which could act as 3 separate oracles? So that's to Kevin. And Shirley, in terms of the interoperability and the representation of the UK at the international level, and I'm asking this question because when I'm looking, you are probably the only person on the panel who has the cross-legal system, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, because I'm probably wrong, in terms of working with the Law Society of Scotland, the Law Commission in Scotland, as well as in Northern Ireland, which is more similar to England, but with the distinctive elements of Scots law. How does that pan out in terms of the different jurisdictions of the rest of the UK in smart and intelligent contracts at the international level? Okay. Kevin, you want to go first?
Sure. So yes, they can all be oracles, and the notion put forward is that you wouldn't just have 3, there'd be different governments over the globe that also has their own oracles, because it's not just about the terminologies in law, it's about real-time events. So these have to be pretty much to the second what's happened, because if a contract's going to action based on an event on the outside world, you'd have to have a majority of those oracles agree that it happened. And with that, you can then say, yes, I'm happy with this contract. I cannot hack all of them, just as you can with blockchain. I cannot hack all of them at the same time. Now, we could say going forwards that with quantum computing, you could get to that stage, but it would be highly unlikely if they were in regulated, like governments, and they were each government around the globe that was doing it. It would be highly unlikely that would happen. So that's why I think it's much better that there are these oracles in governments or regulated environments, and that is then done in a distributed way.
Thank you. Shirley.
In terms of the UK standardisation system, the standards would generally apply across the piece. So if there are nuances within that, and I'm not aware of any particularly that have come up in smart contracts, but that doesn't mean to say they haven't been discussed in the committee, then they would tend to be ironed out to a common approach that would deliver a suitable base outcome for the jurisdictions. So I'm not. Are we aware of some?
Yeah. The standard itself won't tend to be specific for the legislation. That's one of the things that's actually quite important. Legislation outvotes standards all the time. So legislation sits there, standards sit at a slightly lower level and are independent of legislation.
You see, I never go anywhere without the of experts.
I'm just wondering if anybody else wants to kick in on any of those elements.
I mean, the thing about this is that it's all already enormously complicated and expensive.
Yep.
Right? Automation without artificial intelligence is a good way of taking things which are repetitive and making them easier. Automation with artificial intelligence, we're just going to have to wait and see how that goes. So the vast majority of the stuff that we envisage being put into smart contracts will be things which are being done 100,000 times a year. And at that point, all of the nasty, messy, difficult legal stuff has already been done. Everybody's got their endpoints, everybody's got contracts that work to that standard. I would point to things like the ISDA contract, which is used to manage $1.2 quadrillion worth of financial derivatives, as being the sort of thing which is already completely automated in implementation, because the contracts are extremely standardized.
I work with them all the day. Sorry to butt in.
No, please.
I work with them all the time. They try to be standard, and they're not. They're far from standard because we have to process them every time.
It is this.
Is this.
Yeah. But certainly you're going to see much more automation of things like ISDAs than you're going to see it, for example, in used cars.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's not that we envisage this as being, all contracts will be equally automated. It's going to be the high value, regular stuff which will get automated first, and the rest of it will be on some kind of long tail.
And my only issue with I hate that term, the high end kind of contract, is that does that, I'm trying to get the right terminology, abdicate a sense of, is it a philosophical, human, intrinsic element of flexibility in a contract? Because I think, Kevin, you had mentioned, or something you mentioned was missing, in terms of what smart contracts can't do. I'm trying to remember the word that you had actually mentioned. The simplistic contract, yes, but the more intricate contract, the element of human nature versus AI, some people would say that puts the legal profession out of a job. Some would also say that it puts us out of a job as elected public officials.
Not soon.
That's just one. But quickly, next question, Chair.
Can I just make a quick point about jurisdiction, because it's as we know, these sorts of technologies are no respecter of jurisdictional boundaries, and some of the complexity will come with servers being decentralised, and therefore if something does go wrong, if there is a breach or a failure, which jurisdiction, where is the node in which jurisdiction where you can pinpoint that failure or breach has taken place. So I think we're in for some complex jurisdictional issues and contractual relationships if we can't take, and we must take, an internationalist view of this.
Can I ask one question? I would ask everyone to consider, rather than if things are going to go wrong, like when. There will be bugs. This is code we're talking about. People have to code this code. So it's when, and we have to then account for what we do when it goes wrong.
And my former co-workers at the Ethereum Foundation have, I think, collectively lost about $225 million worth of people's money from buggy software they shipped in the last couple of years.
It's about $800 million globally. Lost or lost.
Yeah. And I mean, that's happening. It's a relatively small percentage of the total value of the systems. For kind of the right brotherization of new technology, you might consider that acceptable losses. But it's largely happening because nobody understood that these systems were at the same level of impact as, say, the systems you'd see on a communication silo. So you had a bunch of web programmers just like, hey, let's write a smart contract. And then somebody pours $200 million into the thing and then it breaks. So if this stuff had come out of aerospace engineering culture, and it had been designed by people that were used to putting, software on satellites and machines that couldn't be easily reprogrammed from the ground, I think you would have seen far less deployment of bugs in smart contracts. A lot of it is just that the wrong kind of engineers built the systems, and they're learning the safety culture stuff the hard way. If this stuff had come out of Boeing, I don't think you'd have a lot of debate about smart contracts being secure, because they would have been developed in a completely different way. It's the accessibility of the technology to ordinary programmers that results in these horrendous messes.
Thank you. Right, we'll open it up to the floor now. Who would like to ask a question?
Just two questions briefly. First, Kevin, this might be an extension of the question posed by the Vice Chairman, but does the idea of having universal agreement on some particular set of nodes undermine the idea of having a system that is distributed, first of all? And second, what does and this I think is to potentially everyone, although I think that it was actually Charles's point that brought this to mind. Does the derivatives market tell us something about the interpretation of complex agreements, and what does it tell us? Because here we have banks who have issued structures for many years that have been arbitrarily complex, that have many details in their implementation and design, that have been modeled by computers, and in many cases have been interpreted only by computers. And it sounds very similar in some ways to what we're envisioning here. So what do our experiences in the derivatives market tell us about what we can expect from this.
Can I just interject on that point before anyone answers? Can you speak a bit louder, because there's more people in the room now, so we have to sort of fill the space so that they can hear it as well. So who would like to start to answer that question?
I think the first point is, I would say not really, because we already have distributed. In that sense, you have to have consensus on the DLT, so you're already at the point where you need consensus. So consensus of fact is already there. Consensus on oracles is just making life safer, really, as you go forward, because it's very potentially easy to hack one, hack two, potentially 2, 3, 4. It gets harder the more, of course.
It's not just about hacking, it's about agreement. DNS is a perfect example of why it doesn't work.
Why it can take 12 hours for DNS to eventually get around to agreeing, that's true. But DNS is also used now for far more things than we ever envisaged. DNS is used for geolocation of services. So it's being used for a lot more than it ever was.
And we have a take on this Oracle mess, which is that we interpret oracles as being insurance providers. So an oracle provides a fact and says it's 37 degrees in Kentucky today. And if they give you the fact for nothing, if it's wrong, that's my problem. If I buy a consequential loss insurance that says it's 37 degrees plus minus half a degree, and if I take commercial damage from that, you're going to pay up to $25,000, maybe that costs me £7.50. Right? And so we think of this as being indemnified assertions from a variety of providers that are liable, and if I need more certainty, I just pay more money on the indemnity. And if everything goes horrendously wrong, the whole thing gets worked out as an insurance mess.
So who chooses the providers? Is this going to lead to a LIBOR-like situation?
Well, I mean, hopefully not. But at the end of the day, this is all within the domain of commercial risk inside of the real world. We don't think that you could get this kind of pristine, bug-free, automated execution environment where everything's well behaved. Rather, it's just going to be messy Wright Brothers stuff for maybe the next 3, 4, 5 years. And thinking of this in terms of interlocking networks of commercial liability is probably a much safer way of approaching this than the idea that it's all going to be perfect machine-to-machine, error-free execution pathways. So we really think of the blockchain as being a machine for shoving around liability rather than for being perfect, faithful representation of human intent. It's a liability engine.
Thank you. Would anybody else say?
So we've heard some interesting both opportunities and challenges that you see. I'd like to invite the panel to advise our lawmakers on, fairly specifically if you can, on what kind of regulations would mitigate those challenges and make the opportunities more attractive.
Well, I think that's the journey we're on at the moment. I would not be brave enough at this stage to say what is required in relation to smart contracts, or indeed more broadly in relation to use of algorithms and machine learning. I could say some broad things around that. So obviously, if my life is at risk or my liberty is at risk, then it is likely to be at the higher end in terms of requiring a clear legislative framework. If it is a commercial contract between two sophisticated businesses, then it's likely to be right at the other end. I agree completely with Peter that we should be loath to jump in to regulate around this. We need to be cautious to do that. We need to probably regulate a step or two behind if that is required, and it may be that appropriate standards will fit the bill for most of this, but because it's such pioneering territory, it's really difficult at this stage to be clear about what needs to fit where along the spectrum of legislation, regulation, standards, codes, nothing. But rest assured, we are trying to pull the best minds, the best ideas, and to start to have a stab at answering some of those questions.
Shall I take the last few questions together? So on the derivatives market, I think it's a good example for a number of reasons. First, it's suitable for this type of technology because many derivatives contracts aren't complex. Interest rate trade or foreign exchange trade is a very simple function which suits well the kind of if this then that technology. We also see developments in this area because it is an area where there are oracles. The publication of real-time information across Bloomberg screens and Reuters screens is there, so it's a natural place for experiment for those two reasons. It's also an area where I think from a policy perspective people are more comfortable with the marketisation of information than they would be in a consumer perspective. So it has positive features. I agree with you entirely that there was a section of that market in structured finance that was found out as part of the financial crisis and was both unnecessarily complex and or more complex than the parties understood. I think one of the analogies, and I've worked in that area, not just in the context of smart contracts, one of the things that I think is useful for the smart contracts analogy there is that the contracts were complex and not debugged. They were written quickly under time pressure by lawyers who didn't necessarily understand all of the complexity that their clients were trying to take into account. So they illustrate very well the translation problem that we currently have in not having smart contracts. There is a problem that in a digitalised world where we still rely on paper, and I'm echoing Vinay here, that there is even more scope for disappointment and loss and liability in that area. I think to take, and maybe it is worth saying in all these contexts we should come back to the distinction between permissioned and permissionless systems. I think by and large we're talking here about permissioned systems, and therefore some of the elegance of what sits in the theory is never going to be translated into practice. The second point, I think, again, a significant distinction between consumer and non-consumer positions. I think the consumer perspective is likely to be relatively uninterested in contracts, more interested in outcomes, and therefore I think regulation by reference to acceptable outcomes in insurance support backing that up is going to be a natural place for us to go. Not only because the insurance industry is good at managing risk, identifying and assessing risk, I think we have the ability to take advantage of that. In the commercial world, that's where I think the hard problems lie. And there's potentially a mixed blessing in smart contracts, so we can say on the one hand that they will provide more efficiency for the reasons that we've heard. But there's a world in which they provide much less efficiency because all of this ambiguity has to be turned into questions for the clients and principles in this. So what do you mean by this? What do you mean by it? What do you mean by this? That will be an irritating experience, I think, for a lot of commercial clients to be forced for the implications.
And I was just going to make a comment that yes, there may be new regulation, but of course existing regulation will already apply in certain cases. So yes, maybe big questions around GDPR, but you know that inherently the use of data, the use of personal data is already a consideration. So are we clear around what already applies as well as what new might apply?
Thank you. Anyone else? Or do you want to look back on that?
Briefly, just very, very briefly, we have a thought experiment that we call the Monster. And it's a smart contract with a few hundred lines of code, which we think can violate most financial regulation in a single instrument. So part of it kind of looks like gambling, and part of it sells profit shares from the gambling, and part of it it's a multi-layered thing. Now, it's the sort of thing that a couple of programmers could knock up in 2 spare weekends, and it probably violates, I don't know, 57 different kinds of law. And I think that that's quite important to understand, that the effort required to do large-scale violations of a very complex mess of laws more or less simultaneously, using a machine that people could throw hundreds of millions of dollars into very rapidly if they wanted to, that's a new kind of capability. Programmers have never had that kind of power and responsibility before. Anytime that they did have that kind of power and responsibility, it was usually inside of something like Boeing. The question then is, how do we approach that? Because that's clearly a new generation of tools that are super empowering technologists to get into the real world and do amazing things. But it also means that when they screw up, the errors are on such a vast scale relative to the norms inside of software engineering that we're left kind of standing around and staring at the consequences. I think that this is, if you think it's bad with software, wait till we get to genetic engineering. There's just a general transfer of competence and capability into the hands of technologists that gets them into positions where they can monkey with things at truly epic scales. I don't know whether anybody's followed the debate about gene drive mosquitoes, but it's credible that we could basically get rid of malaria by genetically engineering mosquitoes that change the patterns of inheritance, which have been part of nature for billions of years, a billion years. So, it's the fundamental challenge here is not specific to smart contract, right? It's an increasing ability for technologists to monkey with stuff at a depth and a scale that was completely unprecedented 20 years ago, and it's only going to get more like that. The question then is, do we have to design super efficient forms of government for handling those kind of risks? Do we have industry self-regulation? Do we have a kind of try it, and if you screw up, we'll execute you kind of culture from a Singapore model? This is a fundamental challenge, right? And you can imagine the Singapore model of just don't make any mistakes, right? Versus maybe a litigation model like kind of American, versus a precautionary principle like kind of European. Everybody is going to have to struggle with this discontinuity. I think the smart contract thing is just the first of what's going to be decades of this kind of malarkey.
I'll bring Christine on this, and then I do have 2 other people that want to ask questions. So Christine, and then I'll go.
It's really about the ethical issues and the requirement for an ethical framework here. So it's a piece of work that we are doing at the Law Society. We've set up a Technology and Law Policy Commission, and the purpose of it is to examine the ethical implications through a human rights perspective of the use of big data and algorithms in the justice system. So the issues around, which we haven't talked about today, but are related around transparency and understandability, around bias and the use of data and construction of algorithms, around data protection, data privacy, and basic human rights. These are things we absolutely must face into. And the way that we're doing that is, so I chair it, but my co-commissioners are a professor of ethics and a professor of computer science, and we're trying to bring together technologists, lawyers, policymakers, judges, government, anybody who has skin in the game to start to try and address these really challenging issues, because we get it wrong, or if we don't do it, we could sleepwalk into some dystopian nightmare, which we all see in the films. So we really don't want to do that.
Thank you.
Shall I stand up?
Please, yeah.
Hello, my name is Christian de Waterborn. I have my own consultancy company in blockchain technology and technology in London. And I'm also the global ambassador of Public, which is a media distributed company. This is who I am. I'd like to participate in the debate. Christina, you said some extremely interesting thing. What you said about hashtag, I've been working the past year about stamp dating some documents. I can't talk about it because I'm on the secrecy agreement for a client, but I would say that there's a lot of potential there. What I would like to talk about first is uncharted territory, new grounds to be covered. And there are some new concepts around. We've talked about smart contracts between human beings. We haven't talked of smart contracts between a human being and a machine. I'm saying machine and not robot, and the reason for this is very precise. I would like to ask you a very odd question. In English law, is there a possibility for a machine to be a moral person?
Well, yes,
Oh,
there is
right.
a possibility
I'm
of that.
fascinated. I'll tell you what just after. I'm just asking first.
And it is, because it's not just about machines contracting with human beings, but it's also about machines contracting with machines. And the issue of personhood is something which is an interesting challenge. But we have jurisdictions across the world where things that we would not consider humans have personhood. So in New Zealand, some rivers have personhood. But I think what you're talking about is much more about should machines be attributed personhood, and certainly the House of Lords felt that as an artifice, in effect, to support the ability of one company to be able to sue another, then yes, it was probably right to do that. So I think it's something that we will continue to look at. It's certainly a possibility.
Well, the reason I'm asking this is because I traveled to Germany recently. I participated in the Drupal, community event there, and I bumped into a mind-bending concept, really, I would say. Before I actually mention it, I would say, if you go out of Moscow and you want a car, you just can use a Russian application called Belka, and with this application you can get a Mercedes within 10 minutes walking distance, which you can take. The car recognizes your app, opens the door, you can drive it and drop it anywhere you want. It is for $10. That's one thing. This website is only in Russian. There's no English equivalent. Now, what I've heard in Drupal from a CEO called Ingo Rubik is apparently in Swiss law there is such loop where a machine can be a moral person. And then we get into the idea that the machine could be made by car manufacturers, dropped into the street, and then with some smart contract, repay its own lease as a moral person, and then after that ask for servicing. And then, so we're one step away from robots. Can a robot do the same thing? Can a robot be a moral person? What are the ethical, barriers and questions? And the idea that a machine could be abandoned to its own destiny and have to deal with its own future and servicing as a moral person, I find quite an interesting, challenging question.
I was just going to make a quick joke. So when Chief Legal Officer was once presented a question like that, and he put a thought on our secretary said, well, my first question is, does this machine have any assets?
But it could repay its own lease. That's what's interesting.
Of course, we do already have concepts like corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide. So it isn't inconceivable that we could move towards that. I'm sure Charles has something to say.
Yeah, I think the conventional objection to it is that commercial parties may establish these decentralized autonomous corporations and stuff the liabilities into them and step away. But that would be relatively easy to regulate away. So yeah, I like Christine, I see the possibility in the European Commission.
Thank you. Conscious of time.
Yeah, I'm looking at this from a slightly different perspective. This could University of UCL Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security, not what it was when you were there. Now, we are looking at, there's a couple of trends. One is, away from intermediation, we currently have middlemen, in other words. It's currently a commodity economy, and what we're looking at here is how to commoditize it even more, if you think about it. The trouble with the commodity economy, financial economy, is it's capital intensive. And it's extremely capital intensive both for the infrastructure, which you actually own, you need to have capital for that. Also, it gets riskier and riskier, and you need to have finance capital to cover the risk, the market risk. Whereas services, we heard outcomes from you, Charles. You and I, we don't use oil. I'll take the Venezuelan petro as a great example of something that just doesn't. Have you heard of it recently? The reason is it's complete nonsense. Number one, who here has got a refinery? I don't have a refinery. Therefore, even if I could return the petro in payment for oil, it's not really useful to me. If it was a diesel coin, or if it was a heating oil coin, or better still, heat, light, all these services that humans actually use, then we're starting to get interested. The second point is, it's a coin which has no obligation. Yes, it's backed by all this oil, but does it give you the right to actually pay for oil instead of using dollars? No. So on two different issues, if you like, one is usability, utility, energy as a service, housing as a service, calorie, food as a service. I think we have to start at the outcome and work back and start looking at this is what I'm working on, the institutions, the people agreements, rather than the machine agreements, okay? And then the instrument itself, right? The instrument itself. If I walk into a shop and buy a Mars bar and get a Mars bar receipt, what would you say if I came to you and said, here's a Mars bar receipt, would you give me something for it? Sorry, pal, that's a proof, a payment. If, on the other hand, I have a Mars bar voucher issued by Mars and returnable in payment for a Mars bar, I can walk into any shop, provided it actually has got the right, authentication, and use it. You see my point? The instrument, I call this a credit obligation, is not the same. It's a promise of future payment, if you like, or future acceptance. In my view, FinTech version 2, which is coming down the road very rapidly, and I think what we're talking about here is FinTech 1.5, which is reaching out for FinTech 2. So maybe next year we'll be getting further.
If anybody wants to make a comment on that from the panel, they can. Be very succinct. I'm just conscious of time. We've got about a minute and a half left. Anybody want to comment? No? Oh. There's always one.
So the question is, how much stuff is trapped in bad commercial rooms? Right? All the rooms you can't rent, all the cars you can't drive, all the stuff that winds up rotting on docks. All of that stuff, if you've got the right market infrastructure, all can be fully utilised. I've seen estimates that say it's 20% of the capital in the world, which is $100 trillion of assets. The tricky part of this is that all of our mechanisms for handling assets are incredibly archaic.
Agreed.
But when you modernise them, people think it's a revolution because you change the existing corporate rights. So, that tension between breaking the existing structures and maintaining the existing structures is the hard part of hyper-rapid rates of change.
Agreed.
Special economic zones, right? Building new Hong Kongs or new Singapores in special economic zones with fully modernised systems of property rights, and then when it works, you copy it. When it goes horribly wrong, you evacuate. I think that's really worth a try.
But not absolute property rights, which is either or. In Scotland, we have guilty, not proven. It's in that not proven space that I think the future is.
So some food for thought on that last point. I would just say, ladies and gentlemen, we'll soon have to conclude the meeting. Please can we vacate this room as soon as possible because another meeting will want to come in. I would just like to thank all of you for your attendance, for Goja and the big innovations and for all, but of course to our panel who've been fantastic this evening. Thank you.